And then we moved on to round 3, which I believe would typically be the final round. But when I looked at it, I thought, what the fuck have I done? I've been looking forward to making this video because regardless of whether readers will end up liking or not liking my book, I think we can all agree that the cover is a banger. Writing is very subjective and not every story is for everyone, but when a talented artist makes something so beautiful, we just have to all be on the same page here. So in this video, I will walk through the design process for my book cover and share the ideas that I had for the concept and the artist sketches. This is only going to be specific to the US edition of the book. I did recently reveal the cover for the UK edition, which is also beautiful in its own right, but I was only involved with the US cover. So that's why I have more things to share, at least with the behind the scenes for this edition. The process of making a book cover and the author's involvement seems to be dependent on the publisher. There are publishers who will include the authors in reviewing the artist sketches and ask for their thoughts. And then there are publishers that don't include the author at all, and you don't know what the cover looks like until it's already done. I've seen both scenarios happen to other authors, and I ended up getting both extremes of that spectrum, where I was heavily involved in my US cover, while my UK publisher had their own vision for what their edition would look like. And I think this worked out for the best because I don't know what the UK market is like. As a fellow dumb American, I do tend to like UK covers better though. I think they usually have more sophisticated designs, so if I were to let any region have total control over what a cover looks like, it would be the UK. Now, the US, on the other hand, let's just say I'm not so confident in American aesthetics, okay? Have you seen the state of this country? We need a lot of interventions for many different areas. But clearly from the covers that I have displayed, it has all worked out in the end, and now I got a fun video to share with you all. So before we dive into the process, I want to thank Flexispot for sponsoring today's video. Because as we talk about the aesthetics of the Sleeping Beauty retelling, we may also get the urge to get cozy and fall asleep ourselves. But we can't do that if our beds are uncomfortable and ugly. And that's where the Flexispot Kana Japanese joinery bed comes in. I gave this bed frame to my girlfriend because her old frame was squeaky and she wanted something quieter and more durable. So the Japanese joinery bed frame was appealing because it's sturdy and quiet and much easier to assemble. They use a Japanese joinery structure splicing, which is a traditional woodworking method that interlocks and holds together through tension and compression, which means that it's a tighter structure that can resist wear and loosening over time. It's also quieter because the slats are secured with Velcro, so they stay in place and reduce noise. I also like that the legs here are inward recessed. That way the frame fits snugly against the wall, and then it's more stable and less squeaky. The hardwood is also really nice and strong because the coating is moisture and scratch resistant, so that's going to protect it from mold and scratches. This is also quick and ready to ship because shipping takes within 1 to 2 days and the delivery is within 3 to 5 days. Overall, I just feel like with the high quality materials and the craftsmanship, this is a better price compared to many competitors. I just think that when you're investing in something like a bed, you really have to think about the long-term value and durability. So if you're interested in the Flexispot bed frame, you can click the link in my description below. I'll also have an exclusive code so that you can get a discount as well. Now, let's get back to the video. So the first step of this process was filling out my publisher's art form. This is a document for authors to provide information about their book and what they would like the cover to look like, and these answers get passed along to the designer working in-house under the publisher. My editor filled out some of the information already, like my book title, age category, audience, and genre, and then she highlighted which section she wanted me to answer. So here we have cover comparison titles. This is where I would include images of covers that I would like mine to emulate. She also recommended that I use examples from the same genre and age category, which I presume to be so that it fits within the market. There's another section asking for the specific concept or what's important to convey on the cover. I think these are basically things that are a must-have in the author's opinion. And my editor recommended to also include things I definitely don't don't want the cover to have too. So for example, I am not a fan of book covers that use stock photos of real people on them, so I would make a note about that. There's also sections to fill out the description of the main character and descriptions of other important characters in the book. So this is where using picture references are helpful to make sure that the cover shows the characters how they are described in the book. And then there's also style/artist suggestion. I use this as an opportunity to list specific artists that I wanted to commission for the cover, but I assume that this can also be general suggestions for the kind of art style you would like. Lastly, there is author provided materials if applicable. So this can be a Pinterest board, a mood board, or setting inspiration photos. And so as you look through this document, you might be wondering, why is this page blank? And that is because I decided to be extra and send a whole presentation instead. I want to shout out Annabelle Slater for giving me this idea because she is a romance author whom I met up with for dinner, and I found out that she received the same art form for her debut book because we have the same publisher. So she showed me a presentation that she put together, which is not required, but it's like an extra thing because she had a specific vision and she also has a marketing background outside of publishing. So she wanted to build an actual brief and be very specific with the look and feel that she wanted for her romance books. And I was like, oh my God, this is so smart. I should be doing that too because I have a design background. So I should also treat this cover as something that I would do for my day job. Except unlike my day job, this shit is actually important to me. And so let's go over this presentation together. I built these slides on Google Slides and I used it as basically a way to introduce the book visually and show a bunch of mood boards for the designer that would be assigned to my book and the future illustrator that we would commission. So the first slide is a short blurb. In this queer Sleeping Beauty retelling, a cynical thief and her sister travel inside the dreams of a cursed princess. As they explore deeper inside the lush world, they suspect the girl is hiding darker secrets behind her perfect paradise, and that there are some things their subconscious can't bury forever. In the next slide, I detailed what I wanted the cover concept to be. Basically, I wanted to depict a dreamy world where Ghibli meets Del Toro. These are two movies that have very strong aesthetics going on. The cover should give the impression of a timeless fairy tale book. The illustration should feel magical and surreal, weaving together different landscapes of the dream world. If the main characters are shown, the dreamscape should grow from their heads/hair, implying this world is based in their consciousness. And then I followed up with visual references for the specific idea I had for the cover. So I was really inspired by this book cover called Monstrous Tales, and it technically is not a young adult fantasy, but I do think that it gives a really cool classic fairy tale vibe to it. And I love how it weaves different elements together because Monstrous Tales, I believe, is like an anthology of different fairy tales. And so I was like, oh, how would that look like translated to my novel? So I did a very quick, shitty little sketch that conveyed what I was thinking of. My idea was that the Sleeping Beauty character would have her sleeping face be at the bottom, and the main character, the thief, Corinne, would have her sleeping face be at the top, or maybe they can be on opposite corners. But the point is the dream world would be sprouting from both of their heads because even though this is technically Sleeping Beauty's dream world, when Corinne enters this imaginary world, it becomes a shared consciousness. So a lot of her own thoughts and feelings and repressions and regrets that she is trying to bury do get reflected in the dream world. And so the landscape is, constantly shifting. Everything in the dream world is grounded in nature as well. And so I added visual references of what I thought were creative ways that elements of nature were incorporated into human silhouettes. After that, I also provided a mood board for color scheme suggestions. My first preference was emphasizing on golds and deep greens, just because I think that would have looked really beautiful with Sleeping Beauty's golden hair and the greens that would come from elements in nature in general. My second color scheme suggestion goes more towards deep blues and purples with vibrant colors. And I think this one has a more ethereal, dreamy kind of look to it. The next section in my presentation is the settings, where I would show a bunch of visual references for what the landscapes look like in the dream world, since so much of the cover is dependent on these settings. For those of you who want to read the book knowing nothing about the settings and characters, just skip to this timestamp. Here we have Winterland, where there are snowy mountains, ice caves, frozen lakes. I included a picture of a fox because that is an animal that will pop up every now and then throughout the book. Malicine's ice castle also resides here. And so I underline basically like important things that I definitely want to have in these respective seasonal regions, because there is an action scene that happens in Winterland when they are a dragon. And then we have have Springland, which is very cottagecore. I've always associated the cottagecore aesthetic to Amelia and her character in this book, and I guess like her escapism tendencies in general, because I do think the whole concept of cottagecore relies on that idea of escapism into an idyllic rural lifestyle. But at the same time, it is also criticized for being kind of ignorant about actual real world hardship and realities, especially when it comes to rural poverty, which again is very fitting for Briar Rose. Her cottage resides here, and behind the cottage is a sunflower maze, which is also an important landmark. And then we have Summerland, which is a tropical jungle that's filled with wild foliage and fruit. One of the important landmarks is a waterfall cliffside that connects to the beach. Summer is associated with a lot of fond childhood memories for the main character, Corinne. And she is someone who had dreams of being a painter and was inspired by her mother, who was a painter as well. But since she is a cynical bitch now, she has long given up on her dreams. And so being in Summerland brings her back to that place. Lastly, we have Autumnland. So this is a shadowy and foggy island that is separated from the rest of the dreamscape, because that is where all of your nightmares and repressed secrets and past, whether it's about yourself or the trauma that you've had, all of that gets compartmentalized into this separate island. And so this island has, you know, the typical horror, creepy elements that would be there, like trees carved with screaming faces, but maybe those faces look familiar, I don't know. And silhouettes of a murderous knight and an antler king, which may be clues to certain things that the characters are repressing, but are now distorted into this nightmare corner of the world. But for the mentally ill bitches that can compartmentalize like me, we just, you know, will not look at it. Okay, so now let's get into the characters. For the main characters, we have Amelia / Briar Rose. She is pretty much the typical white blonde bitch that you would expect in fairy tales, and I do plan on having a future video about why I wanted her specifically to be a white girl who has a privileged life but runs into this escapist fantasy because reality and systemic problems are too difficult for her to bear. But I assume you can probably take a guess from there. But anyway, I put some references for what she looks like. And then we have the other character, Corinne, who I wanted to make sure would look more androgynous or masked, because I am a sucker for the butch femme looks. And I also like characters that are very different from one another. And so for a character who is the more cynical one, the realistic one, the intruder upon this dream world that will call out how everything is a lie and has this tension going on with the Sleeping Beauty character, all of that I wanted to show through a character that is more rough around the edges, and also like someone who is very clearly a woman of color. And then we have the side characters like Melusine, who is the demon that had cursed Amelia. But if I were to be so lucky, again, for the artist to draw the dragon form of this character, I had also included references for how this dragon would look like. And then we have Ellie, who is Corinne's younger sister. She has a more tomboyish look to her, and I like that these references show someone who is much more lively and basically more fun to be around compared to her older sister, who is either getting beat the fuck up or is the total bitch to everyone. And then the other side characters are the animals. So we have Talon, who is Melusine's raven companion. We also have Penny and Dime, who are a rabbit and cat that wear petticoats and suits in Springland. And lastly, there is a fox that is made out of clay with cracks in his skin, and he's an animal that constantly follows Corinne around and taunts her with saying very cryptic shit, and you'll find out why when you read the book. And then the final section of this presentation is the artists, where basically I gave a list of artists that I would love to commission for the book cover. I'm not going to show the artists that we didn't move forward with because I feel like that would be kind of weird to air out in public, but it was really a matter of which artist could portray the level of detail and surrealism that I wanted for this book cover and could also be available to work on the book cover in the first place. But I'm happy to say that the artist that we moved forward with was the artist that had been on my list. Her name is Ina Den, and I had been following this artist for several years. The reason why I picked her was primarily for her illustration work with these really detailed landscapes. This was the cottagecore vibe that I wanted to have. I love that they are so nature focused and that they feel like paintings because, again, the main character is someone who used to be a painter but gave up on those dreams, and that tension is pervasive throughout the book for her own journey and development. And I think the nice nice bonus about her joining is that now it solidifies that everyone involved in the production of this book, from the writer, me, and the agent who made this book happen, and the book cover designer, and the interior page designer, and now the book cover artist, all of us are South and Southeast Asian women, which was not intentional, but a very cool coincidence. And it's pretty rare to see that in publishing, let alone most industries in Western countries. The designer that my publisher assigned this book to was also Caitlin Yang, and she is the one who designed the book with the sprayed edges and the type treatment and providing direction and communication with Enid. She saw the presentation I had and said that since I had a very specific concept for the cover, that we could basically move forward with it and use it as a brief and reference point for the illustrator. Let's go into the different rounds of how the artwork has transformed. Okay, so let's go over the rough sketches. Basically, Enid sent over 3 different concepts. At this point, we are not evaluating what the colors will look like. We're also not evaluating the fonts, so the title is just for placement only. We're literally just figuring out what do we want the cover to look like. So here we have version 1, where it is a close-up of the characters' faces, and the elements that are woven in the hair and act as borders around the cover are more so isolated elements of the different seasons, like the snowflakes and the flowers and the teacups. We also have a spine and back cover that has more of like an ornate frame, similar to traditional fairy tale books. Then we have version 2, which is a more direct depiction of the presentation that I given, where you see more of the character silhouettes and the actual sceneries from the different seasons. Amelia's hair would also cross over to the spine, and then the back cover design has a more organic border that still includes different elements of the seasons, like the sunflowers and snowflakes and different foliage. And then we have version 3, which uses Amelia's silhouette as part of a larger landscape. So her hair transitions over to water, and you see foliage growing from it as you look at the full jacket spread. And then there's also Corinne falling into this dream world. So let's go through these options again and talk about the decision making behind the scenes. So the first version is actually the version where I believe both my agent and editor and most of the friends I had asked preferred this version. I think illustrated book covers that show character faces tend to be alluring. At least with young adult fantasy, that seems to be the trend I've observed. It's nice to have close-ups of these characters and the different objects in the dream world, because if you are in a bookstore and you're looking at a book cover from across the shelf, it'll be easier to make out what is going on that book cover. This also frames the title really nicely over version 2 that doesn't frame the title as clearly. One of my friends said that my title might not pop out because there is so much going on here, and even though it's super detailed and beautiful, maybe that would create too much visual clutter, and when you first look at it, you don't know where your eye should go, and when you're looking at it from far away at a bookstore, you wouldn't be able to clock it right away. But despite all of that, my heart just still gravitated towards version 2. I think a unique element of this book is that the story takes place in the dream world, whereas I feel like in version 1, because these are just objects that are shown around the border, they don't really ground the artwork into it being like a separate imaginary world. And because there's like close-ups of these characters, to me this feels more like it would imply to be a more romantic sapphic story. And while the book is sapphic, romance is definitely not a focus in it. So that's why I preferred highlighting the world aspect of it. And my hope was that maybe once we see the actual colors, that can help differentiate the center title better from everything else going on. I also think there's something really cool about having a piece of art that you can just stare at for a very long time to try to analyze all of the different pieces and elements in every single corner. As for version 3, even though the concept is really cool, I think it is the hardest to understand at a glance, especially when a lot of times when you are looking at a book, you're only seeing the front cover. And I think this design requires you to look at the full jacket, but most people are not going to pull out the jacket and look at it. They're only going to see the front cover. So when you block off the spine and the back cover, I think it's harder to translate. I also couldn't really envision the empty silhouette of Amelia's face translating well. It just seemed like, I don't know, is her face just hollow? Is she like Slender Man? I don't know if it could be like pulled off. My one friend, who was in the minority in preferring this best, had liked it because there was more of like an action going on. But something that another friend had said was that this felt almost like an anime poster, and I don't really associate my book to give anime vibes. As for the back cover design, universally, everyone gravitated towards version 2. I like that the borders here have a more organic shape and that the different elements of the seasons are incorporated more naturally. Like it kind of looks like they are intertwined with the vines that are running around the border. So I went ahead and picked version 2, and I also made some very minor notes, basically pointing out just small things. Like, for example, there is a bird in the top left corner that is the same size as Malicine's dragon form on the right side. And since birds are not super prominent in the story, I felt like it would be better to remove the large bird and scale up the dragon just slightly, just so that the scale of the animals made a little bit more sense. I also noted that there should be a red rose pin to where Amelia's heart is, like a brooch. It's not super important, but it's one of those things where if you were analyzing closely, you would think back and be like, oh, that's why they put a rose over there. And then lastly, I just pointed out that Amelia doesn't wear a necklace, but Corinne does. And I just reminded what the necklace should look like. All right, now let's move forward to round 2, which are the color sketches. This is where we would evaluate what color schemes work best and evaluate different font choices for the title as well. This is version 1, which as you can see follows the mood board that I had given where it emphasizes the golds and the greens. Caitlin, the designer, used a serif font for the title and a sans serif font for the author name. And if you're not familiar, serif fonts are letters that have extra edges sticking out, and sans serif fonts are fonts that don't have the extra edges sticking out of the ends. And then here we have version 2, which uses the color scheme of the second mood board that I had put forward. It's much more vibrant and neon, and the font choice for the serif title is different as well. There's actually like a mixture of both serif and sans serif with the smaller words versus the bigger words here. And then we have version 3, which I think is kind of similar to version 1, but with a different filter placed over it. And the font for the title is a little bit more low-key as well. When it came to the fonts, my publishing team all really liked version 1, but then when they shared it with a larger team, they got feedback of it looking young. Based on all of the options, my preference was version 2 simply because of the variety in font sizes. I'm personally not a fan of every word in a title being the same size like in the other options. I did agree that the font in version 1 did look too young, but I also thought the font in version 3 looked too skinny to be a title, especially in the massive space that's in the center of the art. I also think the author name should be the same serif font as the title, because when you use a sans serif font, like in this example, for me, that also reads as too young and modern. Like, I associate this kind of font to be more on like a young adult contemporary book, but not a fantasy book. And that brings me to the request that I felt the most strongly about, which was to use a different font entirely so that it looks more like a fantasy book and would ensure that the title is prominent even with the busy artwork surrounding it. I think we should use a serif font that looks bolder, thicker, timeless, and dramatic with flourishes like swooping curves at the ends of letters. So I sent examples to show what I'm talking about. I just think for classic fantasy or fairy tale books, you gotta be extra with the lettering. And I love how this example has those extra flourishes at the ends of the letters. I also shared some fonts that I like, for example, Mythical Romance, Fantasy Magist, and the last one is not a font, but this is custom lettering treatment that I think also looks cool. I also mentioned that it would be a nice bonus if we could have the artwork interact with the title as well, like a trailing vine wrapping around a letter. But then when it came to the color schemes, we all had different opinions about it. My editor shared that her favorite is actually version 2 because it felt the dreamiest to her and that the deep purples and blues lend to a moody atmosphere. The designer also preferred version 2 for those same reasons. The imprint team was mostly split across the different versions, but a few more were leaning towards version 2 as well. But there was some concern that the cover might read too young fairy tale with all the bright colors. So that note was shared with the designer to see if she could try to mitigate that worry with maybe our color palette and final art finish. I also asked if there was a way to blend the 4 different landscapes together so that it feels more seamless. So for example, maybe Amelia's flower crown could transition into the sunflower stalks in Springland, and then maybe the jungle foliage could blend in with Corinne's hair. Basically just tying these details together so that it's almost like one cohesive circle. I was curious to know if we should try to differentiate the 4 landscapes more clearly to convey the different seasons. Because even though Winterland does stick out a lot, that's also why that landscape looks so intriguing, while the other landscapes are all similar greenery. So maybe more sunflowers and pastels for Springland, and maybe more bright oranges and sunsets and daylight for Summerland, and then there's browns and fall foliage and foggy atmosphere for Autumnland. You know, just like different ways of showing the time of day and the time of the year. But I was also like, if you think that looks too busy or confusing, I understand. All this to say, say I did have extensive notes. I felt so nervous about being a diva or appearing like I was being too demanding because it really is such a privilege that I didn't want them to regret looping me in. So I tried to be like as polite and professional as possible. I really emphasized that for all of the suggestions I gave, if the team or the artist found any of those things would overcomplicate or detract more so than being helpful, then I will defer to their expertise. I'm grateful to be included in the cover design process, but I don't want my notes to dictate final calls if they're not working effectively. So then my editor replied back to me and said that she met up with the designer to talk about next steps, and their focus for the next round would be making sure that the cover reads like it's meant for older YA. And then we moved on to round 3, which I believe would typically be the final round, but when I looked at it, I thought, what the fuck have I done? So this is presumably what the final cover would look like. Take it all in because there's a lot going on here. My fears came true. I think I led the cover astray. The good thing is I like the new font. It definitely evokes fantasy. I also appreciate the distinction between the lands and that the details are still very beautiful. My strong suggestions were, first and foremost, I think there needs to be way more space around the title. This final cover feels cramped and boxy, whereas the previous one had more breathing room around the title, which helped show a focal point. I realize the boxy effect may be due to Enid trying to intertwine elements of the art with the title, which had been my suggestion, and I see now that it was not working, so I recommended not forcing it. I decided to play around on Photoshop and attach an image where I basically took the original colored sketch but put in the new font for the title just so that we could see what the same spacing looks like with the title. I also asked for more space and hair between the dreamscapes because this final shows the dreamscapes as blocks next to each other, which I think is what's adding to the boxy and cluttered effect. I also mentioned it's totally okay to reduce the details of the dreamscapes, especially for Springland, which I think has like a bunch of details going on. Very beautiful, but maybe a little bit too much. Ideally, these changes would help clear up more space. I also felt like we needed to brighten the color scheme because even though the team had suggested going with a darker color scheme so that it wouldn't skew young, I actually think that tweaking the colors to be brighter and vivid would help retain the dreamy atmosphere that the color sketch has. So I added a second attachment where I basically took the cover and brightened it up on Photoshop just to show what I mean. Basically, I think these adjustments help make the story feel more fantastical, and it also helps Corinne not get lost in the background like she currently is in the final. And then last thing I felt strongly about was adding blue to the smoke coming from the chimney that also transitions to the water. I think that needs to be more blue than white right now, just so that it avoids looking like an empty block of space. I also wondered if we should reduce the line work because right now a lot of the lines give a harsher effect instead of dreamy, and I was hoping for a softer blending like we have seen in Enid's previous work. Especially when you analyze Springland, it's so busy with all the flowers and details, but then in contrast, Winterland does not have that same line work. So one landscape feels busier than the other, and overall I was just wondering if we should dial back across the dreamscapes to match Winterland. And so after that, we get into the actual final round of the book cover. Because we were under a time crunch, Enid wanted to send over a rough sketch showing the progress that she's made just so that we can improve it, but also noting that it's not actually complete yet and she still plans on making other adjustments. Basically, the changes that were made is that she adjusted the space around the title to free more space and have a more organic flow between the dreamscapes. She brightened the palette, she softened the line art, she went back to the chimney and water transition like the one from the earlier color draft, she matched the detail levels between the worlds. She also placed the Antler King in the center of Autumnland so that he would be easier to see, and overall she improved the dreamscapes composition so that it would feel less cluttered. Caitlin wasn't sure if the blue was giving dreamy vibes, so she also tried out a more toned down blue purple for the background and added a slight layer of warmness to the overall art. And she pointed out that the sunflowers in Summerland feel like they're abruptly cut off, so could the cutoff be more seamless? I did kind of feel like the lack of ink and texture for Amelia and Corinne were throwing me off. I knew that it was still in progress and I shouldn't be evaluating based on that, but like, again, it was too distracting for me. So what I did was go back to Photoshop and I did like a rough copy and paste of them from the previous version, just so that I could evaluate better without being distracted by that. So I agreed with the new changes that Caitlin had asked. As for the sunflowers feeling cut off, I did suggest that maybe we could have one of the sunflowers peek out over the border. And I also thought that adding more gaps in the hair strands would help make it look less abrupt and more organic from her hair. I think it would be nice to have snowflakes drifting by as well, like in the previous versions. And I was also cool about the last note about petals flying into the space to the left of the title, as long as the sunflower petals would be be a similar small size to the leaves flying in from Autumnland, just making sure that the scale was consistent across the board. And so in the final stretch, we got the final art with 2 slight color variations. And the color variation I ended up with, as I'm sure you know by now, is the more purple one. Just because I felt like the other option was more earth toned, and to me that translates as being more grounded in reality. So I kind of felt like if we deviate from that, it might feel more like a dream environment. And that finally wraps up the final cover. And now let's properly zoom in on all the details and admire it once again. I can't emphasize enough how Enid truly knocked it out of the park with everything. Like the level of details and coloring and thought that she put into it. I connected with her after the cover reveal because throughout this whole time during the cover process, I never actually got to talk to her like in person directly. All of the communication was handled by my editor, who was basically like the middle person between me and the designer. And the designer was like the middle person between our team and Enid herself. She said that the sketch and presentation really helped her a lot in the process, especially with all the details I listed. So it was nice to know that me being a little cuckoo and adding a bunch of detail was actually helpful for her. I also didn't know that they actually sent my book over to her, like the digital manuscript for her to read through. And I believe that it should have been optional. Like she didn't have to read through it, but she actually did. And she took copious notes about the different settings that the characters were going through and the different features that the characters had. And again, that really goes to show the level of care and consideration that she had. She also sent me a time lapse of the earlier stages of the illustration. So I'll go ahead and show it here if you want to see it come to life from the rough sketches to the first color draft. Overall, I am so glad with how the cover has turned out. I think that it is understandable sometimes for publishers to not want authors to be so involved because authors might not necessarily know what's best in terms of like design. That's like what the designer's job is for. So the fact that they were willing to let me be so heavily involved was huge for me with having that trust, even though it also made me nervous that I would steer them the wrong direction. But fortunately, it worked out, largely because Enid is such a talented artist and because Caitlin is also a great designer. They just have done above and beyond. And once again, I need to express how cool it is to have a team of Southeast Asian women come together to make something beautiful. I'm also happy to report that I will have more beautiful art to share with you in the future. I've already shared a couple of tidbits with my book reveal video where I actually got to see the hardcover book and I went through the naked hardcover. There were also design choices made about the interior pages, and that was made by a different designer within the publishing team, also a South Asian woman. We love to see it. So I will go through that process in a future video. And I'm going to show you some very cool artwork that will be created by Enid once again, because we are in the middle of working on some pre-order goodies. This is brand new artwork, and that's all I'm going to say about that. And I also plan on making other publishing related videos, like reading my first chapter and breaking down the changes that I had made. I will also make a video that talks about why I made the characters queer when I had identified as straight at the time. I will also make a video about my revision process and editing process and all of that kind of jazz. So there is still a bunch of content for me to share leading up to the book release on June 2nd, or if you're in the UK on June 4th. And I will see you next time for more bookish videos. Goodbye.
At some point, I started getting perceived.